I wanted to give a special thanks to the folks that helped us make the event happen, Eva Fortes from the Open Society Foundations, Robert Donnelly, and Miguel Salazar from the Woodrow Wilson Center Mexico Institute. And I hope everybody enjoys the conversation. We're getting started a bit late, so I'll hand it over to Andrew, who will go from here. Thank you.
Great. Well, Wanda, thank you. Well, first of all, I want to thank OSI for really organizing this panel. We're very fortunate to be able to host it. Rob and Miguel on our end have done a great job pulling this together, but this was an OSI initiative, and we're very pleased to be able to work with them and to host this. Recognize Cindy Arnson, the director of the Latin American program over there, Dr. Diana Negroponte, one of our board members of the Mexico Institute, who's walking over there. And let me say that, the right to information is an issue that has gained a great deal of steam, a great deal of attention recently, particularly as we move into a period where it is no longer, in most countries, certainly in the region within Latin America, but also in much of the world, of thinking about mere democratization in terms of elections, but actually about accountability. How can citizens hold their governments accountable? How can they have access to information about what elected leaders and appointed leaders are doing? And then also, what can they do with that information? And we're very fortunate to have today three panelists who are deeply involved in this in Mexico. Mexico has one of the more ambitious laws in access to information around. It's one of sort of a new generation of access to information laws, but also has enormous challenges. And part of the reason why the law is so strong in Mexico is that it is coming out after a history also of a great deal of lack of transparency. And so, here you have a situation where the legal mechanisms are strong, but the inertia in the other direction is also very strong. And so you need actors that are able to really move this agenda forward. As I'm sure Guillermo will tell us, at a state level also, access to information is often not nearly as legally supported as it is at a national level. And we're very fortunate to have both a national and a state perspective, which is often left out in these discussions, where there really are, I think a lot of the major debate is happening right now. You have the bios of everyone, so let me just start off. I will sort of introduce people just very summarily as they go on, and then we'll go for the three panelists, and then we'll have the two commentators. Gabriel Morales will start off. She is the Program Officer for Access to Information, Artículo 19, very exciting organization, relatively new organization that has been working on freedom of expression in Mexico and doing great things around both journalism and access to information. So, Gabriela, why don't you start off?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning. I am much honored to be here, and I want to thank the Open Society Institute and the Mexico Institute for the organization of this event. Especially, I would like to thank Esther and Andrew for inviting me to be a panelist today. My presentation is about achievements and challenges on the right of access to public information in the current context of Mexico. A number of achievements were accomplished on RTI in Mexico, especially regarding to the legal recognition of the RTI. I am going to mention only three of them. Firstly, the approval of the access to information legislation for the federal level in 2002 was the beginning for the legal development of Mexico in RTI. The Federal Transparency Law was recognized to be, at the time of its approval, as one of the most progressive legislations for access to information, and it was an international and a national reference. One of the main successes of the Transparency Law was the creation of an oversight body on the subject of transparency and access to information, the Federal Transparency Institute, IFAI, as a means for the protection of RTI. Secondly, after the approval of the federal law, the approval of the 32 local transparency law precedes. This is also considered as an indicator of the development of the right to information in Mexico. Finally, the further development of the right to information in the Constitution is another achievement on the right of access to information, since it's a means to strengthen the constitutional and legal guarantees for the fulfillment of the right to information. Regarding the promotion of the right to information, a movement of RTI activists were organized in the beginning with the specific objective of pushing towards the approval of federal transparency legislation and then local transparency legislations. Afterwards, other civil society stakeholders took an active role in advocacy activities for the further development of RTI. In Mexico, since 2001, there has been a strong community of RTI advocates that permanently promote and defend the right to information. This is another achievement for the right to information in Mexico. However, after the constitutional reform in 2007, we identify a number of challenges that right now are beyond the achievements for the right to information, precisely because they implicate serious threats to these achievements. During this presentation, I am going to make reference to 4 of them, which for us are the more serious threats for access to information in Mexico. Firstly, the continuous attempts on the part of the executive power to weaken the Federal Transparency Institute. IFI is the basis of the protection of the right to information in Mexico. It is the main guarantee for the right to information, and it is considered as the flagship for access to information in Mexico. We have a permanent monitoring exercise on IFI's resolution and on IFI's performance, and we must say that there's a need and a space for opportunity for the promotion of better resolutions. However, it is undeniable that the fulfillment of RTI in Mexico cannot be understood without IFI's work. The hypothesis that we defend is that the Federal Transparency Institute should have the last word on the subject of transparency and access to information. Its resolution should be final to the public authorities that must comply with the transparency law. Requesters, on the other side, can challenge IFI's resolutions on the judicial courts. This is their right, and we don't have any problem with this. But the public authorities needs to be directly obliged by the IFI, and the legal guarantees for this need to be granted at the legal level. Based on the 2009 report delivered by the IFI to the Congress, we can observe that during 2008, 26 of IFI's resolutions were suspended due to amparos or procedures for the annulment of the resolutions. During 2009, 15 resolutions of IFI were suspended due to these facts, amparos and annulments. This is what we understand to be the judicialization of the right of access to information. This is what we consider to be in detriment of the right of access to information. If a requester makes an information request and he just has to wait till the IFI decision to deliver the information, the process would last 6 months. If the requester has to wait until the courts dictate a decision, the process might last till 2.5 years. The second issue related to the first one is the need to promote transparency on the criminal justice system. After 8 years from the approval of the RTI Federal Transparency Law, transparency and access to information has proven to be some of the most effective tools for accountability and for civil society to have an oversight role over the performance of the government. One of the most controversial policies of the Mexican state is the security policy focused on the combat against drug trafficking. This might possibly be the reason why the General Attorney's Office has restricted public interest information regarding the performance of the authorities that are in charge of the criminal investigations. This is especially serious in the context of insecurity that prevails in Mexico. This is especially serious in a context which increasingly more civil population is affected by the drug trafficking combat, and the levels of impunity keep getting higher. On June 21st, the media made public that on a report delivered to the Congress, the executive power declared that of 22,000 homicides related to the combat against drug trafficking, there are only 1,200 criminal investigations open. If the data are accurate, because these are not official numbers, this would mean that only 5% of these homicides are being investigated. procurement of justice is a space for opacity and corruption in Mexico. The attempts on the part of the criminal justice authorities to weaken IFI and to challenge transparency, federal transparency law has challenged the complete system for access to information. Right now, there is a discussion on the Supreme Court of Justice regarding the issue if the Information Commission should have the final decisions on the subject of transparency and access to information. This is going to be decided for a southern state of Mexico, that is Campeche, and the General Attorney's Office has publicly and legally declared that it is its interest for that the decisions of the Information Commissions be revised by administrative or judicial courts. After the constitutional reform, Mexico has now one of the most development frameworks to guide the development of right to information. But there is a need to harmonize what the Constitution says with the local transparency law. Finally, we identify a need to strengthen the RTI movement in order to make a broader defense for access to information. The defense of access to information should be embraced by the society as a whole, should be promoted by academics, by media, by politicians, by political parties, by everybody. And this is especially relevant in an adverse context for access to information like the one that prevails in Mexico right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gabriela. That was fabulous. Next, we'll go with Guillermo Noriega, who is the founding director of Sonora Ciudadana. He also writes in El Imparcial, one of the good newspapers in the north of Mexico, particularly well-known and respected, and is a political analyst for TV Azteca. So, Guillermo, good to be here.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, the Woodrow Wilson Center, for having us here, and to Open Society Institute for the invitation. I will address also in English, so my father will feel it was worth it paying the English classes. So hopefully he will. Well, I wanted to address you and provide an overview as complete as possible from my experience preparing, promoting, and using the right to information at the grassroots level in Mexico. My colleagues here are taking care of the national macro vision of the phenomenon and how it works, its challenges and problems, and I rather cooperate to this discussion with the local perspective. How is the right to information, how it is or it is not being used on the states out of the big urban intellectual groups? And only try to give you elements to discuss. I've drafted 3 questions, hopefully I will have time, and we must say that having all states in Mexico transparency law, first, is the right to information used by ordinary Mexicans. Second, someday the right to information will help to the best exercise of other rights, like human rights. And third, what are the strategic issues to consolidate the use of the right to information at the grassroots level? I will jump and say that from overseas, Mexico looks like a leader in right to information. We have a system that could be taken as a leader. But we are right now suffering what I like to call the opacity consensus. The political system, political parties, groups of interests, and others realized that right to information was too dangerous to their interests, and constantly, almost every day, try to make it seem like it works, but pushes permanently for counter-reform so it won't. If you think Mexico is only a few steps behind the democratic best possibilities, at the local level we live in what I like to call the prehistoric democracy. No guarantees to freedom of speech, or a huge risk on it, no access to information on a very deficient one, no civic participation at all, a monopoly of the public by political parties, etc. At the local level, there are no incentives to participate in any democratic process different than regular elections. System could boycott your family business If you participate in any advocacy activity, you could be harassed by the official media, among many other instruments to keep people from participating. It wasn't easy creating Sonora Ciudadana, I must say. The system obviously didn't want us. However, this 2010, we're on our 5th anniversary. We began pushing for specific reforms in transparency and accountability, and now we moved to the realization of a right, using right to information, and I mean we push for the right to health to be a reality. Specifically, we organize patients on communities to fight for their right to health, and right to information and budget analysis, as well as lawsuits, are the best tools to obtain it. I will address to this specifically later on. As for the first question, is the right to information used by other ordinary Mexicans? I would like and I would love to ask if right to information is used by ordinary Americans as well. The answer isn't easy. I must say no in general terms. Regular Mexicans still believe that having a friend in government is the best way to access information or to solve a problem. Nevertheless, there are arguments that says Mexicans don't want to know, Mexicans are not worried, are more worried on surviving surviving poverty or on their security, or those arguments that says that Mexicans don't want transparency, they want jobs or roads, are not accurate at all. We have seen that when you give an instrument as powerful as this, even to the poorest, when they get to see the information, when they feel their arguments are right and strong, they get involved and they want to keep on knowing. So that's, on my experience, one of the first issues to work on. Promoting right to information using only democratic arguments isn't popular at all. We need to relate it with the population's problems first and convince them that it's more likely to solve them with this tool. Information is power, and power must be on the citizen side. That's why it is mandatory to work directly with the population. Teach them the basics of public administration, knowing who to ask for the information, what type of documents to see, etc. We need to build citizenship. Asking the government is a complex procedure. It's mechanically as easy as sending an email, but without knowing the recipient's correct email address. With no clarity at all on what to ask, and with a recipient that could do whatever is possible for not to answer. Furthermore, our experience tells us that after the first failed request of public information, if it's a lonely process, the citizen won't try again. So the answer to the first question is that at this level, not even local NGOs are good enough on accessing information. But I still insist citizens need to know, they have the right to know, they need to know they have support step by someone, beginning by detecting their problem and the need of information. As for the second question, will someday the right to information will help to the best exercise of other rights, like human rights? I must say that it is happening right now. Not always, but there are several groups asking governments and using this information to fight, for instance, for more budget for health or education. And they do it with more than good wishes in their hands. Nowadays, they have data, analysis, better possibilities to influence public decisions. Access to information should not be seen only as a tool to fight corruption or showing frauds. As a matter of fact, I strongly believe, from my experience, corruption scandals in Mexico have undermined society's capacity to get surprised and demand for changes. The overuse of media scandals generated over the years the idea that RTI is exclusively for journalists and is seen only as a tool to look after frauds. People do not know they can use it to improve their daily lives. That's another challenge. Some must go out there and show them. In Sonora Ciudadana, for instance, we help discriminated public workers, teachers, police officers, garbage workers, to fight for their right to health. We fight for changing a norm that discriminates all those who have a pre-existing conditions. I believe here in the United States know what I'm talking about. After winning the first case with the help of Fundar's strategic litigation area at the Supreme Court, who declared the practice against the Constitution, others joined together in a group, formed a community of discriminated public workers. Nowadays, they are fighting, asking their government of Sonora about their spending and pushing for equal access to services without discrimination. We've just found, and if we have time we can see a video, but we just found that the government of Sonora spent $400,000 on a dancer, a flamenco dancer, for a festival. And the argument for discriminating these public workers is that they don't have money to, because they're very expensive, because they are already sick, so they won't go into the hospitals. So we use public access to public information to push for it and say the government, it's not possible for you to tell me you don't have money and you spend $400,000 on this. Hopefully, at some moment, not only public workers, but also the users of other health systems around the country, diabetic communities, and others, could get organized on what we call the rebellion of the sick and use their right to information to demand better public services. As a matter of fact, we're working precisely on that. It isn't easy because we're fighting for a cultural change from letting governments do everything and anything to get organized and involved in the solution of our problems. To the eyes of the American culture, could be seen as a simple step, but for a Mexican, it's a huge change. We fight the predominant culture that prefers to seek solutions by our own, first than rather, or pushing for institutions working as they supposed to be working. And finally, as for the third question and concluding about the strategic issues to consolidate the use of right to information at the grassroots level. On my consideration, first, Mexicans need to know their rights. Someone has to tell population what their rights are, how to demand and use them. Second, Mexicans need to understand the importance of organization. No major positive changes will be seen unilaterally from the government. That's something we must understand. So it's our obligation to get organized and advocate, push, fight for them. And third, RTI should be promoted as a tool to empower citizens to better exercise their rights. NGOs and public institutions should be promoting among common people from a realistic perspective, that is a very important thing, from a realistic perspective, the use of right to information as a tool. And walk with them until they learn how to use it. Or develop strategies to translate population requests as a bridge between authorities and citizens. Thus, to think on a long-term path to walk, knowing our rights and how to fight for them, getting organized, and knowing how to obtain information are the three major areas with possibilities on working with the population at the grassroots level in Mexico. To finish, I must say, we have truly witnessed the effects of right to information on people's lives. We truly hope and believe we're building a better future here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Guillermo. We're going to switch to Spanish, actually. So if you need headsets, if you don't have them, if you need translation into English, there are headsets right outside the door. Feel free to do that. We're very glad to have Miguel Pulido with us. He is the executive director of Fundar. He also teaches at the Universidad Iberoamericana, but he is previously associate director at Fundar and now executive director. This is an organization that's done really exciting things on transparency for a number of years right now. It was started by a number of people, including Sergio Guayo, a few years back, but has gone through a number of sort of incarnations as it has grown and extended and done some really dynamic work. And I think everyone here is many ways part of the larger Fundar network as well. So, Miguel, adelante. Good to have you here.
Gracias, Andrew.
Thank you, Andrew.
Well, in principle, I think I need to give apologies for having arrived late. I have to tell you that I swear that it was involuntary this time. The second thing is, please excuse me for speaking in Spanish. Just like my colleagues, Gabriela and Guillermo, I had brought my presentation prepared in English, which I thought I would read to you, at the risk of losing you with my pronunciation problems. And I was afraid you wouldn't understand everything, but Andrew was so kind as to tell me that I could speak in Spanish, and that allows me to do two things. First, to express myself better in my native language, but secondly, to not reiterate what I had brought, because it's identical to what my two Mexican colleagues just said, and this way I can make a better contribution to this discussion. So the magic of these little books is that it allows you to go back into the past and to revive a previous speech. And so there are a couple of ideas that I would like to share with you. I already had the chance to present this at a seminar with some colleagues at the National Autonomous University in Mexico, and this is a reflection that started with the following question: why do we want or not want a system of access to right to information in contemporary Mexico? The truth is that Mexico distinguishes itself as a country of contrasts and paradoxes. It's difficult to understand that we would have a very sophisticated elections regime which has one of the most perhaps highly developed designs in terms of rules, principles, and procedures. But at the same time, we have a crisis every time we go out to vote. It's also difficult to understand that we have 33 institutions that protect the right to information, and it's centralized. In other words, they specifically respond to requests for access to information from the executive branch in the federal government. But at the same time, the number of requests to the federal government does not exceed, according to 2009 figures, 500,000 requests over 8 years. If we add this trend in the rest of the states, we don't have very much data, but it's around 800,000 requests for access to information during a system in which it costs Mexicans more than 1.1 billion pesos. So what I'm trying to say is that we have very complex and sophisticated institutions and complex and sophisticated rules to access this right to information. But as Guillermo was saying, it seems that we don't make tremendous use of the access to information at the most grassroots level. Added to this, we have a system of access to information which has been replicated in other parts of the world, or at least it has influenced what is developed in other parts of the world. In tandem with this, it is questioned not only by academics and activists in civil society, but by the users themselves who routinely try to access information. For this reason, I have to tell you that it's very difficult to explain how Mexico, a country of so much paradox that has this sophisticated development, also is so behind in so many ways. I could continue. However, I would like to insert two thoughts about what, in my view, occurred in Mexico as we were developing our model of access to information. The first point is that normally, for some strange reason, in Mexico, there is a lag between the development of a constitutional law and the development of secondary laws which implement that legislation. We have a right to health in the Constitution, but when you review the secondary laws that would guarantee access to health care, you see that there is a whole set of obstacles and barriers that hinder people's access to health care. In the case of access to information, it's the same. It seems to be a unfortunate cultural expression of the role played by this right within the political class. It translates this way. There is a state-of-the-art progress under the Constitution, but then the rules of law that have to implement that constitutional right lag far behind. The second important point that was receptive to the right to the access to information, or RTI, has to do with the legal framework and the implementation of public policy that do not dovetail. In Mexico, we have a very sophisticated system of RTI. However, we don't have the same level of sophistication in our filing system. This means that we have the right to answers on the information that you requested, Mr. Citizen, with so much, but you really can't get it. You have a right to this, but I have to say that the document was never generated, it was poorly managed, or it was crudely destroyed. The third problem that I think that we face in Mexico is that it's not just a matter of the fact that public policies are not aligned, but rather various actions that have to take place are not aligned. I am specifically referring to what's happening in government budgets. In Mexico, no one thought very much about what the budgetary implications and legal implications would be of transferring to a system of RTI. If you look at a Mexican system in which there is heavy bureaucracy that is not highly professionalized at the municipal and local level, and they do not have sophisticated techniques for document management, it caused us to be in a short circuit. Furthermore, there is an expression with temporary Article 6 of the federal law on transparency and access to information, which I feel is symbolic of what I'm trying to explain. This article says, and it's existed since 2002, when it went into effect, that we cannot budget new resources for the implementation of the federal transparency law. This means that the law was passed and liaison institutions were ordered to be created, and they created a special bureaucracy on RTI. However, this had to be done with the same money that they already had. No additional money, in other words. In Mexico, we have a saying, which I imagine exists everywhere, but it's that is, scratch yourself with your own fingernails. Take care of yourself. In concrete terms, what this means is that we have these three problems: a constitutional system which is not aligned with the secondary laws, a legal system which is not aligned with public policy, and a whole set of regulatory mandates that do not have enough budget behind them has created certain dilemmas. Having said this, I go back to the question that I was asked to discuss with my colleagues. Is it or is it not relevant to have a system of RTI in modern-day Mexico? If we understand that all of these aspects pose problems, and all of these may cause a clash between the requesters for information and the bureaucrats that receive it because of how they manage this relationship. It's a whole set of law, public policies, and budget, since they do not align. So this causes citizens that are hungry for information to clash with the bureaucracy that does not have the structural capacity to process these requests for information. Within this context, and if we add to this the difficult situation of structural violence our country is currently experiencing, is it reasonable to have RTI? The unanimous answer was yes. Allow me to tell you that I am pleased to share with you that the answer was yes. And this is because it was not a traditional expression of, well, it's better than nothing, or it's better to have this than to just have the right to opacity or to not have the right to transparency. The fact is that it seems to us that the only way to make it obvious that there is a misalignment between these three categories is to try to work with it. That's point number one. Point number two, which is related to what Gabriela was telling you, is that there seems to be a direct connection between the opacity within which the bureaucracy in Mexico has traditionally operated in Mexico and the terrible consequences or the lack of results. The case of violence which we experience thanks to organized crime today can't say that this came about by spontaneous generation. It didn't come out of nowhere. It's the accumulation of years under which the authorities work in opacity and were not accountable, and the police were not professional, and they were not accountable for how they were spending public money. And all of this led to the crisis that we're experiencing today. So in closing, allow me to share two central considerations with you. First, what I've tried to tell you is that the situation of transparency is a not isolated problem within the political regime or the different conditions that we see as a political society in Mexico. Rather, it is emblematic, and it seems to explain many of the things that we need to turn around in our country. And I also feel that it is emblematic because it not only explains what we have to change in our country, but at the same time, it has become a tool to turn around other structural problems that we face. The second consideration I'd like to share with you is that it seems to me that the challenge we face today in Mexico is to ensure that the right to information and various considerations that are coming up in terms of individual litigation and litigation between different cases such as the clash between IFAI and the Campeche group, as Gabriela was telling you about. These individual cases, as they get resolved, will have less of an impact. However, if we understand them to be emblematic, then this helps us to understand that judging individual cases is not a replacement for public policy. What I'm trying to say is that multiple requests for access to information and different amparo remedies will never replace the honest, necessary public policy of transparency, which is what we really need in the country. However, each of those individual cases may be emblematic and may explain why we have to change policy in our country. Thank you.
Very provocative. Thank you. Let us turn now to our two commentators. Let's start with Kate Doyle, actually, who's a senior analyst at the National Security Archive, both an avid consumer of freedom of information laws in the work that she's done on human rights in Mexico and Guatemala and around the hemisphere, both the U.S., above all FOIA, but also, I gather, the Mexican access to information laws, but also who's accompanied these processes in Mexico a great deal and worked with a lot of organizations. Kate.
Thanks so much, Andrew. And thanks to the Woodrow Wilson Center and to the Open Society Institute for having me here, and all of us, first because we get a chance to speak to you about what's happening in Mexico, which is quite extraordinary. And second, on a more personal level, I get to actually meet Memo Noriega. I get to sit at the table with Miguel, and I get to meet Gabriela, people with whom I've been talking for years, but all through email and phone. So this is a lot of fun for us in many different ways. I want to, while acknowledging the description from the various panelists of the setbacks that have taken place over the last couple of years in Mexico, of the tremendous pushback that we are getting both at the national and the state level on the gains that Mexico has made in the right to information. I'd like to acknowledge that, but I'd also like to look at some of the advances we've made. And really, I want to comment on the three presentations with four very simple analyses of where we are and how we can move forward at this point, because we are at a critical stage in Mexico. It's a very difficult time for the right to know, the right to information, despite the constitutional reform, despite the advances we've made. So what do we need to do now to move forward and resist the growing obstacles that are appearing in our path? One, I think, very important, is despite the setbacks, we need to recognize the gains, because the gains have been really extraordinary. And I understand when Guillermo says the idea of Mexico being a model for the right to information for the rest of the world is difficult from the trenches. It's difficult to see that from the trenches of Sonora or whatever state you're in when you're part of the grassroots organizations fighting for this. But the fact is, Mexico is a model. It remains a model, and there are very good reasons for that. I mean, we sometimes don't talk enough about the gains. Let me name just a few of them as examples. If you today want to know if your doctor is actually a doctor, you can go online and look for his professional license and confirm whether or not he is in fact part of the medical profession. If you want to know the same about your teacher, you can do that now too. That is part of the kinds of advances that have seeped into the system that I think we need to acknowledge. If your child is going to go to school for the first time in your neighborhood and you want to look at the schools in your area and compare them to make an informed decision about where to send your child, there's now data on the websites of the Education Secretariat comparing the statistics of the schools in terms of the salaries and the kinds of classes and the teacher-student ratios. Again, that's one of those tiny, really important gains that in this country we take so for granted, but in Mexico has slowly been seeping into our landscape of information advances. There's tremendous amount of work, and Fundar is a huge part of this. But so are all the groups sitting at the table here. There's a tremendous amount of work being done on analyzing budgets at the national level and at the state level. One of the tools that some of the groups are beginning to develop now is trying to look specifically at how much money the federal budget has allocated for the states and whether or not that money has actually arrived. I mean, these are some of the kinds of tremendous work that is going on under the roof of these new, fragile but present guarantees to the right for information. So recognizing the gains, I think, is tremendously important as a way of inspiring us and reminding us of why we're working on this. Second point I would make, we need to measure the impact. And it's something that Article 19 and Fundar have just worked on and produced what they call an index of transparency. I actually thought you guys might present that today. It's a tremendously useful tool. It's just been put up on their websites. And it's a kind of a baseline. It offers us a baseline as to where the states from, the northern border down to Guatemala, where the states are in terms of their own transparency according to a series of measures that the organizations figured out. We need to measure the impact in a whole bunch of different ways. We really haven't done this. Is there more reporting on corruption because of the freedom of information laws that we have now? Are there, we know very gross sort of aggregate statistics from the EFI site about the number of requests or the number of appeals. What kind of effects are these having? The National Security Archive did an audit over this last year that we're going to publish in December about the response of the Secretariat of Defense, of the military, to transparency requests through the National Infomex system. And of course, everyone sort of naturally, given the state of Mexico today and national security and the way militaries are all over the world, would assume that the findings of the analysis we did, which was to try to measure the satisfaction of requesters according to a bunch of different variables, did they receive the information they requested? One would imagine that, in fact, the answer would be no, that for the most part they didn't. In fact, when we measured the impact of the Freedom of Information Law on Sedena, we found that the vast majority, about 80% of the requesters, received the information they requested. Now, there's a whole bunch of analysis that needs to happen around that. Our analysis says that's because most requesters are asking for the simplest kind of information. Miguel was talking about needing to write an email but not knowing what the email address was or memo was.
It was.
That's a classic in Mexico. So people are actually using the right to information request to send a request to the military saying, what is the phone number of your office? So those are the kinds of impacts and sort of qualities of what we're getting from these laws that we need to measure. Third point, we must focus on the states. There's been too much analysis and conversation and high-level conferences like this looking at the national level. The national level is supremely important, but it's the states where these fights are really fought. And Guillermo knows that firsthand. Everybody here has traveled all around the country trying to gauge what's going on at the state level, and the experiences are radically different. And it tells us a whole lot about how the authorities in different parts of the country are responding, are coming up with strategies to deal with this new right and answer it, or are resisting, are putting up walls. The Campeche example is a perfect example. The Campeche case, which is going to decide whether or not these agencies can go above the information institutes, whether it's IFAI at the national level or these state-level information institutes, to appeal to a tribunal. It is a critical case. It's going to have repercussions all over the country. So we need to look at the state level to help us understand how this right is being interpreted and implemented. And finally, because we only have about 5 minutes as commentators, this is hard. Finally, I would say, fourth point, we have to use the press. I understand why Guillermo says, it's not just a right for the media, and it's not just a right in order to gain information to create a scandal. That's true. But I think the press can be our friend. We need to find mechanisms to explain to people why this matters. Because people don't, the right to information, it's sometimes hard to kind of get people to wrap our minds around, why does this matter? And the NGOs can go out and explain this, but we also need to use the press in our behalf as a tool to difundir, spread the information and provoke a dialogue about these rights. The archive and everyone at this table, again, and many other organizations are working and have for several years now on a national initiative called Mexico Informate, which is a way of linking state activists, journalists, and openness advocates to generate conversation in every corner of Mexico about what this right is. We are putting on conferences in universities. We are pushing the press to write editorials about the right to know. We are trying to work with investigative reporters to use their laws to obtain data that they can then use as the basis of their investigative reporting. And those kinds of initiatives that are shared initiatives with a whole bunch of groups are a way, I think, again, of spreading the word, of trying to generate this kind of national and state level dialogue. So I'll leave it there and let my fellow commentator speak. But I do want to say congratulations, because the three people sitting here have been their organizations have been some of the most important organizations for promoting this right that exists in Mexico. So thanks for having me.
Okay, thank you. Our last commentator is Daniel Sabet. He's visiting professor at Georgetown University. He's working on an important book on professionalization of police in Mexico. And hopefully you can, in addition to commenting on what has been said, touch on something that Miguel also mentioned briefly, which is, what does this all have to do with the major issue that, we constantly read about in the news that has become a major part of the U.S.-Mexico bilateral agenda, but the whole question of public security as well.
Okay,
Dan.
great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to participate with these very interesting panelists here who have really devoted their lives to doing some important work. I'm the academic up here, so I'm supposed to say something kind of academic-y, which in kind of listening to the presentations, it kind of sounded like there were three kind of arching variables here to kind of help us understand when we see greater access to information, when we see less, and we can understand those as kind of the formal rules of the game, which I think there's a consensus that are generally very positive, although there might be some counter-reform movement there. Kind of the informal rules of the game, and that's kind of the discretion that individual authorities have. Guillermo mentioned the opacity consensus, which is a notion that I like very much, that there's kind of these informal rules, regardless of what the formal rules say. And then the third thing would, of course, be kind of civil society pressure, demanding and insisting on that information. And I think as everyone has talked up here, we can see that there are both kind of pluses and minuses on that scale. Even in the kind of the informal rules category and this opacity consensus, I think even there are some kind of positive things that we can see, that some very significant changes that have occurred. I study public security, as Andrew mentioned, and my experience probably isn't that of the typical and average Mexican. I'm coming from the outside, but I have probably requested 150 interviews on public security with police leaders, municipal leaders, and I've never once been turned down for an interview. And I think that is a recognition of that people in positions of authority do recognize that they have a responsibility to provide information, and also, Guillermo mentioned the notion that people still perceive that they need to know somebody to get the information that they want. And I can tell you in my personal experience, anytime I know somebody, it's a complete dead end. And when I follow the formal channels, it generally turns to work out okay, which has always kind of surprised me. So even in that informal area, I think there are some positive things. And then on the civil society end, we have three very positive examples sitting up here, and I think that has to be recognized. But also, this is a place where there's considerable weakness, and the news media was mentioned. And I was just meeting with about a month ago. I did an interview with an editor from a fairly major publication in a large Mexican city, who I will not name, and I asked, "How are you using this legislation?" And he told me, "Oh, we don't really use that. It takes too long." And I was like, oh no, they're taking, they're going past the required times, so I said, well, what do you mean? And he's like, yeah, it takes like 2 weeks to get information. And I mean, this is the reality of the Mexican news media, and maybe not for the large national papers, but every day they're trying to come up with the news stories to report on tomorrow, and they don't have a 2-week time horizon that they can request information, and so that's, I think, a real weakness. So there's strengths and weaknesses there. I mean, I have an interest in transparency. I mean, I do view transparency as an end in and of itself, but I'm kind of interested in it as a means to achieve accountability. And one of those that know me, my kind of hobby horse is the lack of continuity in public administrations. And I've always kind of been waiting for the emergence of good indicators that we can track over time, in terms of performance of how governments are doing, and we can track changes over different administrations. And one of the frustrations that I have seen is that even though I view transparency as a key way to obtain continuity across administrations, transparency is beholden to individual administrations in many ways. And so there's a variety of information that, particularly at the local, at the municipal and state level, that just disappears at the end of the administration, and you can't find it anymore. And so administrations are willing to provide you information about what they are doing, but unwilling or unable to provide you information about things that happened just the year before they came into office. If you go to the portal for transparency, and you can, which is a wonderful web page, and you can find all these great informes and things like that. But even at the federal level, you can't find anything that predates Calderon in many instances, and that can be enormously frustrating. One of the positive things that I view was this movement to create citizen observatories whose job would be to be gathering that information, creating reliable information, and tracking it over time. In the area of security, which is my main concern, there has been enormous delays in creating those. The Acuerdo Nacional in August 2008 kind of contemplated creating these throughout the nation, and really there's not any good examples that have emerged. Even the national one has not really emerged. And so, how can we take this issue of transparency, this issue of taking information, how can we turn that information into reliable indicators that we can track over time? These organizations have attempted to do that in many ways, and how can we kind of scale their efforts up to really be something that we can see nationwide and be tracking those changes over time. The opacity in the area of public security is a very serious and very real concern. I was doing an interview about a month and a half ago with somebody who was from the police department, his local police department, and the council member was soliciting information, and he was refusing to give that information. And this was stuff that would be available to the public, much less a city council person. And pressuring him, he's like, well, he was a politician, he's going to use this against us. There's still that very predominant notion that I'm not going to give the information because it's going to be used against me. And I kept pushing him. I'm like, well, doesn't he have the legal obligation? Yes, he does have the legal obligation. Well, then shouldn't you have sent the information? Okay, yes. So there is kind of a work that needs to be done on kind of educating to overcome these preconceived notions that still exist and are still out there. One of the reasons why the citizen observatories have not gone forward in the area of public security has been an issue of trying to this consensus of opacity, as Guillermo said. One of the frustrating things is you can ask the Attorney General's office for information and they'll give you what they have. But that's not the whole picture, because you need to know what the police have. And so you go to the police and you get a different set of indicators. And they don't match up. They overlap. And so what you really need are combined information where you have the Attorney General folks and the police folks sitting down and saying, okay, here's where we overlap, and giving a real good indication of where different crime rates are. And so right now, as a citizen, you can go out and you can ask the information, you will get it, but it does not give you an accurate picture. Now, in several places, the authorities have created those kind of bases cruzadas, databases that are sharing that information. And yet, do citizens know that those exist, and are they requesting that information? And I talked to the Citizen Observatory in Chihuahua, and they were still working with these two separate databases, even though the Chihuahuan authorities had created a centralized database. Why? Because they just didn't know. And so, there are just innumerable challenges, as our speakers mentioned here, but I think we can point to both positives and negatives, and we do have to, as Katie mentioned, we do have to recognize the considerable advances that have been made. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks to all the panelists. Now is the time where you've been very patient. This is a very knowledgeable crowd. I recognize a lot of the faces out here. So why don't we open this up to your questions and comments, and we'll let the panelists respond. And Milene, you had the first hand up over there. And then.
Hi all. My question is about IFAI's budget. If there are any news about IFAI getting the budget it needs to also be able to work on data protection, and if that's not going to happen, how do you think IFAI could move forward with both the responsibility to take care of transparency and data protection with the budget that they're operating with right now?
Why don't we take 3 questions to start off, Eduardo, and we'll let the panelists respond.
Hi. I have 3 minor...
If you can give your names, by the way.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm Eduardo Bertoni from the Center for Studies on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information at Palermo University Law School in Buenos Aires, not in Italy. Miguel tempted to me to speak in Spanish, but I will try to with my English, even my accent, Miguel, sorry. Minor comments, and I would like to hear your reactions, and I have one specific question. The comment is, Miguel, in your presentation, you mentioned something like the citizenship are hungry for information. I'm not sure if that is true. I mean, it's probably citizenship is hungry for more transparency, is hungry for a lot of things, but I don't know. I mean, maybe in the Mexican context you have a different experience, but or maybe I am misunderstanding your statement. Maybe hungry for information is hungry for information, and that's it, which is not exactly the same to say that the people are very, enthused to use access to information laws and the mechanisms that exist and so on and so forth. So this is one first comment and query. The second is related to the media and access to information, something that Kate says, and Daniel also mentioned something, two different things. One, we at the center, we are currently finishing a paper on the role of the media and access to information laws. It will be published soon. The analysis is not just how the media used and promote access to information law, but also how the media was or was not useful in promoting access to information. And there, Kate and Daniel, the results of our experience is not unique. I mean, in some situations, have some sort of partnership with the media, with the press, was very successful. Mexico is one example. In other situations, it's a backlash. I mean, as soon as you put together the access to information and the media, politicians start thinking that this is, as Tony Blair just said in his book, that the access to information is like a weapon. So they want to kill the politicians using access to information. So some situations are, I mean, I will not say that in general, encouraging the media to go with civil society in promoting access to information is always a good idea in terms of strategy. And also, in some way, in some situations, we found that the journalists, as Daniel said, they don't want to use access to information laws. And this is part of some sort of education for the journalists as well, because access to information laws or regulations are not for any kind of journalism. I mean, of course you need time to receive the request. And if the journalists need to cover something that is happening tomorrow, they are not going to use access to information. And that's good. I mean, it's not a problem. And they can use access to information regulation for other things. So my comment and question there is it necessary, this linkage with the press? And my final question is, most of you mentioned that it was very important, and Kate says that, Miguel says that to take into account what happened in Mexico and look the half full, they have a full glass and not the half empty glass. I mean, look the good experience. But my question is this. Are we talking about the impact of the access to information law in Mexico? If we do some sort of counterfactual exercise and say, okay, imagine that the Fox administration didn't promote the access to information law. I mean, is the access to information law the real tool that promote this situation that Miguel, and I go back to the beginning, that Miguel says that this situation where the citizenship is hungry for information, or access to information laws are not that important? It's more important to promote transparency, to promote the regulations that you have in place in a country, and then start thinking in putting in practice some specific regulation. Thank you. I'm sorry if I was a little bit long.
Third commentator. Well, okay. Thank you. And then you had your hand up, and then we'll go back to others. We'll do a second round here. You had your hand up, and you had your hand up. So.
Thank you. My name is Priscilla Rodriguez from a Mexican Center for Environmental Law. I'm sorry, but it's the same. My comment is related with the same comment from Miguel when he said that the hunger of the for the people to get the information. I kind of disagree with that, and my experience in Mexico working with communities, with grassroots communities, we are trying to defend, some cases with them, and we are using the information that we take, or the data or the documents that we take from the government, and we explain the community why this is important for them, in order to get a good judgment, and they understand, and they are trying to connect. They are trying to do or to reply the experience in different, and trying to solve another problems within their community. But the problem, and this is like kind of another comment, the problem with them, I think, is that there is like a barrier, a cultural barrier, a cultural wall in their minds. So they are, because they are survivors, and they are, even if they kind of understand that the information that you can get from the government could be useful in their real life and in day by day, they just don't think about it. They just forget, and they are just trying to, again, going to the land and going to their own problems. And right now in Mexico, with this horrible, violent situation, it's obviously more difficult. So I have like this general question in my mind is like, what we can do. I understand, and I'm with you guys when you say that obviously the right information could be a great tool, but what happened with the people who has to use it that cannot afford it or cannot, like Kate said, take for granted. That's not the case in Mexico at all. So we in United States it's pretty obvious. And when Kate says, "Yeah, you can go to the," I put another example. As an environmental lawyer, I go to EPA data information in their websites, in its websites, and I can see what kind of where is the water that is coming from my tap, where it's come from. That's amazing. But in Mexico, it's like, well, obviously, that's not the case. But you, as an American, or, the people who live in here, you understand what important is the quality of life, what important is that your kids has to go to a really good or good teachers at a good school. You are taking more seriously about what about your life and all these services. But in Mexico, with the communities, it's not the case. They are just trying to get some money from the land, from their products, and trying to survive right now. So that's it is a question, even if I'm sorry.
More commentary. Okay, we're going to go back to the panelists, and then we have two people who had their hands up, and then we'll go back and take others, but we have some time still. So, Miguel, why don't we start with you? You were mentioned a couple times.
I'm going to use, again, the translation tool because... Let's see, if I speak in Spanish and the people don't understand me, what's going to happen if I speak in English? So, my point is this. Eduardo, mi punto es que yo sostengo que la gente
I argue that people are hungry for information. I would dare say that I won't move from that position. Second, that's expressed on occasion in people using the system that has emerged in the wake of the law on transparency, what is known as the active transparency system, or on some occasions, which is much more on trial and error basis, the access to information regime per se. And this is something which, on a drip-by-drip basis, the first thing you get, well, let's look at it in market terms. The citizens have a demand for information, and I cite an example of the poor people that Priscilla gave because I think it's an excellent way to explain what the evidence says. There's a study by Felipe Evia de la Jara, who's well known to us Mexicans, and Christian Greenberg in Argentina. They take the case of opportunities in which they explain and show the level of demand for public information to get access to a social policy program which is basically allows for people to survive, to their subsistence. And there's a need for public information. There's information that the government has and that citizens need. What they do is they cross-check the number of requests for information, the requests for public information, not necessarily through the law, but by phone, through a call center that the Oportunidades program has, and they graph it out on in a pyramid where those who receive oportunidades. There are many who make use of the ability to request information through the program, but none through the law, the regime under the law. As I say, the access to information is never going to take the place of public policy. That's what I was trying to say. We need to have a public policy of transparency and access to information. Second, from my point of view, it's absurd to think that what we need are so many people requesting information that we need as many requesters of information as voters. This would bring the system down. For me, the access to information is like the access to justice. When I need it, it has to be there. It has to be efficient. They have to resolve my problem. Now, that doesn't mean that we are all going to go en masse to make requests for access to information. And that's what I would say. Well, just one thing in terms of what Emmy said. I think that what you say fits within the notion that we give a legal mandate and then take away the budget. From my perspective, the IFAI is not going to get the resources it needs for protection of personal data. We have a highly sophisticated law on protection of personal data in Mexico. I think that's fine. What I think is very bad is that they're going to have to do it with 16 million pesos more. And far from gaining in protection of personal data, we're going to lose in transparency. If highly sophisticated legal regimes are put in place, they need to be given, endowed with reasonable budgets. Okay, I'm going to speak Spanish too. I'd like to begin at the end and picking up on the idea noted by Miguel. I think that if I could die of obesity, I may be predicting a catastrophe here, because of having the authority but not the funds to protect personal data, not having the funds that it needs to operate, we might end up losing out a lot. Going back, and I'm struck by the debate about the glass half empty, glass half full. I always have this debate with decision makers, be they legislators, public servants. They say we've gone so far forward. In Mexico, it was impossible 10 years ago to see something like this. But in terms of the glass half full, half glass empty debate, I think it's relevant as to whether or not you're able to quench your thirst. It's a different level of analysis. And if I go to the local level and the work there, certainly we can compare the schools in Mexico, but there's no capacity whatsoever for a normal family to be able to choose their own school. Or certainly we can verify the possibility that the doctor who is providing the attention is really a doctor. But if I don't have any access to internet and I don't know how to use it, so there is a shared reality in a system that dissimulates itself as functional. This is what is happening with IFAI. Under a culture of dissimulation, everyone's going to applaud us. They're going to say you have a highly sophisticated law on personal data, a great transparency law. All the states have their own transparency laws. Everything's fine in Mexico. Yeah, there's some problem with implementation. You'll have that at some point. But actually, people prefer to go and ask in the old style, to go ask some friend in the government or to bribe someone to solve a problem and so on. So I think there is a problem in the day-to-day work there that I'd like to point out. In terms of consensus for impunity, or I should say for opacity, well, this is tied into the culture of impunity. And another in terms of what's happening with the media. Seldom do we see the political class reach such agreement as they have in backsliding on access to information. There, the lines blur among all the political parties, and they all agree that transparency, it's like it's too much because it's used precisely as a tool, as a bazooka against politicians. Well, in effect, it is a bazooka to be used against politicians. and it's used by the media as a bazooka against politicians. That war between two extremes, the media, also manipulated by vested interests, and politicians manipulated by vested interests, have made it such that there have been great setbacks in access to information. And in the middle, there's a large mass of us requesters who want to make economic, social, and cultural rights a reality, but it's not possible because they are down in the trenches as shooting off the bazookas at one another. So certainly, as Eduardo was saying, the press and the media are a fundamental point, a fundamental actor for being able to consolidate this. And week after week, on the news, I appear on a news show, and I promote access to information, but we do this from the perspective of not you have to ask your government, but what problem do you have? So we choose a problem each week. You have a drinking water problem? Well, why don't you ask about drinking water? And see how you can make comparisons. You're not going to say, I don't have any drinking water. You can say, why does such and such neighborhood had 3 or 4 repairs from the standpoint of principle of equity and help and accompany the population at the most local level. It's hard for this to happen at the national level. It's very difficult to do it at the local level. We do have an opportunity and the task when they reach our office, and they do come and they knock on the door and they say, I have this problem, and then we want to try to channel the situation based on their problems. And the most basic instrument, the best one we found, is access to information. So it's a fight for information, and as I say, it's extremely complicated to implement it. And I think that I've also answered what Priscilla had to say. It's a pleasure to see you here. But in effect, as I said, organization, participation, which is particularly fundamental, and knowing one's rights are fundamental. People don't know they have a right to ask. They don't know that they have a right not to be discriminated against. They don't know what their human rights are. Someone needs to tell them. That gap where there's no public policy of transparency, where the governments say, come, ask, we're totally open. There is a gap that we need to try to fill. That's it.
Thank you. I, too, will speak in Spanish in order to be sure that I'm more precise in my thoughts, and also because I already spoke a lot in English. Now, with regard to what Melanie asked regarding the IFAI budget, I just want to point out that from my vantage point, this is going to be one of the agenda items regarding transparency in Mexico. The challenge of protecting personal data under IFAI and access to information is a matter of budget, it's a matter of structure, and it's a matter of specialization. It is a matter of the fact that since right to information and freedom of expression are not absolute rights, and they are connected to the right to privacy. From my vantage point, this is one of the new agenda items. Now, with regard to the relationship with the media, I think that the move to access to information started in the press and a commitment by the press, and because journalists play a very important role that we activists sometimes cannot play. The capacity to access circles of power and to serve as a counterweight to the sitting politicians. I think that we saw that some actors in Mexico withdrew from the movement for a long time. After the constitutional reforms, it was thought that the agenda of access to information had been carried out, and it hadn't. Legalization of RTI in Mexico opened up a lot of other agenda items, such as implementation, access to right, and now there are attempts to roll back RTI. Now, with regard to the last question from you, Priscilla, I think that convincing the vulnerable population on the use to access to information is an issue of successive approaches. So what we've seen is we have an example of theirs. They're using RTI to defend other human rights or to prevent violations of human rights. It seems to me that you also have to see the interrelationship between the different levels. First, organizations such as Article 19 are trying to work at the grassroots level and with indigenous communities. And we have seen that our specialization is not there, but rather we need to train those who ultimately can have sustained continuous intervention at different levels in Mexico. Because if you go show them the importance of this right, and as Memo said, you need access to information in order to exercise your rights. But if you don't have a permanent presence, you're never going to be assimilated in day-to-day life. Thank you, Gabriela. Now we're going to go back here. I think we had somebody.
There's someone with a hand up here, and then back there, and then we will go back to others here. Yes.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you. My name is Leonel Ruiz, and I'm working with Congressman Reyes. Okay, first of all, I don't know who this question is going to be to. How do you guys measure the index of transparency, more or less, if you want to give us like some background for it? And second question, it's going to be for you, Kate, since you mentioned it. How do you reconcile the need for press to actually make the information public when Mexico is the most dangerous country to practice journalism in the world? And the audience can put their translators back because I'm going to ask that in Spanish. Va para Miguel y para Guillermo. En tu presentación, Guillermo, dices que el problema data un poco, bueno, bastante, en la falta de unidad en la ciudadanía. Y tú, Miguel, dices que el problema data en la falta de capacidad de los gobiernos, hablando en fondos. ¿Qué puede hacer la ciudadanía para reconciliar, hacer un equilibrio en esto? ¿Cómo puede afectar esto positivamente?
Okay. Gracias. Back there.
Thank you very much. It was wonderful presentations by everyone. Carol Excel from the World Resources Institute. I have a two-part question. There was a lot of discussion about the model that Mexico created in its transparency framework. I think you mentioned that. And I'd like to know a little bit more about it. I'm not quite sure the constitutional reform that you spoke about. How has that impacted the actual either federal or state level laws? Is it that people now have a constitutional right that they can exercise after they have used their other rights at state level or federal? Can you just explain that in terms of the model? And in relation to the challenges and opportunities, what would you have done differently? What to make this system work better in Mexico if you were the government and had a lot of money and really cared about transparency and accountability? How would you have changed it and made it better? What are your suggestions? What would be your priorities for, say, next year if we wanted to make it differently? Would it be investing in call centers to make the right real? Would it be working and putting more money in education for the populace? What would be your priorities? And thanks for the information about the flamenco dancer. That's a very expensive flamenco dancer. I'd love to hear why they did that. That sounds, really ridiculous. All right, thanks.
Your name again, sorry. Carol.
Carol Excel.
Thank you, Carol.
And right here.
Hi, good morning. My name is Ana Paula Sanchez. I'm an information user, let's say. I used to work for CEMEX Mexico and in strategic planning, so I totally understand the importance of index indicators and performance indicators, sales, volume sales, everything. So I can totally relate with the necessity of implementing similar indexes to the pursuit of transparency in the information in Mexico. I had a lot of trouble in CEMEX to find information about projects applied in infrastructure. There was a lot of information on the plans of development, but then there's a great weakness in terms of what was actually done. So I would like to know a bit more information if you know if there's any strategies being taken in terms of the follow-up of the actual plans. And sorry, the English makes me nervous. And then also, could you comment a little bit more on the Mexico Informate? That seems to be a pretty nice initiative and everything, but I mean, I'm very, let's say, I'm from the generation of the informed young people, let's say, and I had no idea there was an initiative called that way. So, how can you access like people like me that are interested in pursuing these things? What are you doing to market these programs to people and actually provide information on how I can follow up on these necessities of, I need the information, and even in the private sector, we need to, as a construction materials company, we needed to know the programs for infrastructure. So even the private sector has interests in knowing how can they develop their business. No, that's my question.
Yeah. Marcos, we'll end with you on this round.
Hi, Marcos Mendiburu, the World Bank. I have a question to all three, actually five. If we're maybe putting too many expectations on access to information legislation of what they can deliver, if you look at countries like the US, Canada, UK, business are the #1 users mostly in the countries. Then you have journalists. So I understand it's important to use it to leverage other rights, as Guillermo, you said, but have we seen that somewhere? I mean, if you look at South Africa, has a great law, but implementation is, I mean, to some extent weak. In India, you have definitely an important group of users at the grassroots level. And I always ask the question, why not in Mexico? I agree with you on Oportunidades. There they have the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, but there are provisions within those development programs. In the case of Oportunidades, you have not only access, I think, units for citizen complaints or attention to citizens, etc., that are there, on the ground. You don't have the IFAI in Mexico City. So there are different components or provisions that add to that. So my question is, I understand it's important to push for this, but have we seen that? Because Kate talked about measurement, and now we have internally in our institution, but other academics are trying to measure the impact of this legislation, and we haven't seen that. And there is a great study that was recently published by University College London that says, for instance, that the Freedom of Information Act in the UK didn't increase trust as politicians promised. So just wanted to be cautious in that.
Let's start with Kate. If we can do some sort of quick responses from all the panelists, let's just go down the aisle.
All right. Well, there's absolutely no way that I can wrap my mind around all the fascinating questions, but I'm going to try to say a few general responses that I hope will touch many of them. I do agree that we cannot look to the laws, the access to the freedom of information law, as somehow being a way to leapfrog over a whole landscape of social problems and poverty issues and opacity. What I do think we have discovered in the course of the last, 7 years since the federal law and then slowly the state laws became implemented, is we have found creative ways to harness the decision to pass a law and the sort of movement, citizen movement, and I would call it that, since it was journalists and civil society much more than top-down impulse to pass this law. We have come up with creative ways to use the law as a way of promoting civic participation, as a way of supporting social movements in a whole bunch of ways. And I think one of the real challenges for us and for any country with the opportunity through these laws is to identify this whole menu of constituents. So it's not just about journalists, it's definitely about the business sector as well. And it's not just about academics, it's also about community activists. And I don't think anybody in their right mind who has ever worked on freedom of information and has really used a right to information law, I don't think anyone in their right mind would claim that openness activists are out there pounding the streets to try to get people to file Freedom of Information Act requests. That's not what it's about. It's about the culture of transparency. How do you create the culture of transparency? This is a tool. And why Mexico? Why has this happened? This comes out of a coyuntura. This comes out of a real political moment, which was the 2000 election, which was, before that, the political reforms of the 1970s. I mean, this is the product of a long fight, a long incremental process. And we can call it the demand for information, or we can just call it, citizens' rights. We can call it, we can say we're just sick of the government condescending to its citizens. I mean, that's, I think this has become a vehicle, in essence, for trying to identify what it means to be a citizen in Mexico. And that's why I insist that both the laws themselves and the broader movement around them and the ways that people have harnessed them, and Priscilla, described one way, and it's actually an amazing story. There's amazing work being done harnessing them. That all of that is a part of this effort to be better citizens and to challenge the government to respond to that demand. Let's talk afterwards about being dangerous to be a journalist. I agree, but there's reporting on drug trafficking. There's many different things to report on, and so I still believe, Eduardo, and to your question, that the media can be a tremendously important messenger among many other messengers about why we need to ask our government questions, as Guillermo was saying, and we can use the laws. There's many other ways we can get information from the government. I'll stop there. There's so many things to say. I want to contrast, and I think you guys did it yourselves. You say, let's not paint Mexico as a model because we have all these problems. It's true, but you yourselves, in your own stories about the work you're doing, are not just talking about an opacity consensus. You're talking about a transparency consensus. Thanks.
Anything you want to add in?
Maybe just briefly on the journalist question. When it comes to public security, I mean, if you read most newspapers, it is a regurgitation of the official line on what has happened. They're just reporting the facts. And so to the extent that journalists could use, I mean, investigative journalism and the going down and really doing the dirty interviews and publishing that, yeah, it is very dangerous. But that is why waiting 2 weeks for an information request from the government provides journalists with cover, because they're just producing already existing information. And so there's a very strong argument that would say that actually it's a safe way to still be fulfilling their journalistic mission without having to run those risks of doing the kind of more dirty investigative journalism that we know is too dangerous. So I would kind of flip that on its head a little bit.
Thank you. I will try to follow Kate's model to develop an idea and respond insofar as possible to the many questions posed. In response to Carol's question about how to improve the model in Mexico, it seems to me that there are many things to be done. One is how we promote this right. How can we get society to exercise this right? And this is related to everything else. Development of RTI in Mexico came through electronic means. Only 1/4 of the population has internet access, and so we need to assess how many people will actually use the system, because it's not a very simple system. What it simply does is to homogenize things. We need to get the authorities to take actions in order to allow people to have access to the information when they try to exercise the right. Now, with regard to Marcos's question, in my view, it's very important to answer that. In my view, for countries such as Mexico and other countries in Latin America, in which we are still consolidating our democracy, we've just had 2 opposition administrations since we've been changing parties, and laws on access to information are instruments to institutionalize this, and it's what we need to consolidate our democracy. Laws on access to information, I believe, also standardize, having difficulty with that word, transparency within government. We had standards on environmental information. That was part of what gave rise to the demand to access information in order to have transparency in one sector. And then we saw this demand for transparency spread to public subsidies. And so we wanted to have standard treatment for all of these requests for transparency. And I think that's a positive development. But having legislation on this is not the end of the road, it's just the start, because the major problems are in implementation and exercising this right. And as people have said, how can we have a fair culture of transparency so that everybody can incorporate into their day-to-day life the exercise of this right? They call me Memo. And it's a lot easier to remember, and it's easier for my American colleagues to pronounce. I would also like to start with the end. Insofar as I understood the process or the theory of change, and as I mentioned it 7 years ago when we began to make information requests, it was that starting with the regulatory framework that we had opacity, and then the requests and demands for information were going to cause EFI and the guaranteeing organizations to adopt more principles of maximum publicity, and that this would allow us to have a revamping of the legislation in order to have a regulatory framework that lends itself better to transparency. In other words, EFI have taken decisions beyond the law. They've gone beyond the laws, and they said, yes, I see that in exclusively legal terms, those should be preserved. But in response to the principle of maximum publicity, and because it is of interest to the public, we need to make this information public. That is why the federal government tried to place a tribunal over IFI to review the legality of their decisions. If they impose a tribunal above IFI, the tribunals are going to say, strictly seeking, if with strict interpretation of the law, that right should be reserved. So that's when Carol's question comes into play, as well as other anxieties that we've all mentioned within what I call the opacity consensus. It is precisely because there was an intent to have to defend information, government information, to keep it to the government, but not necessarily that we have a receptive political class. In other words, they're not so worried about it. And this also gives us a clear idea. The climate of impunity makes it possible for nothing to happen. Previous governments were a lot worried about that if we said that they weren't transparency. this is part of a statement by another NGO leader to say that if you say the government of Sinaloa wasn't transparent, and that really caused a problem, they felt bad because they thought that they were going to have to pay a price for it at the next elections, but they didn't. So they don't worry so much if they get accused of being less than transparent. That's why indicators are so important. And Leonel's question, well, I'm going to tell you that, for example, when my colleagues put out the information index that set these standards, we say that after 5 years of insisting on reform of the transparency law, we wound up passing this out to all of the representatives and say, look, we're not making it up. For 5 years, we've been telling you about this, and there have been 3 different legislatures that we've sat down with, and now you have to make some changes. So they changed the Constitution, and now we're trying to change this part. In terms of what would we do if we were in charge of the government, and what would we do? I think it's a cultural change. It's a cultural change because we Mexicans are not culturally used to organizing ourselves to bring about change. And it's a cultural change because we're not used to asking for information. We get by with what we have. And it's a cultural change because we're not accustomed to demanding things. We were brought up within a political system in which you go and cast your vote at most. And you elect a president or a member of the legislature to do whatever they do, and then I go home and don't worry about it. This is a deeply rooted cultural system as part of Mexico's day-to-day life, and we shouldn't try to believe that it's any different. That's how it is. And now to conclude with what Leonel said, and also Ana Paula mentioned this, and maybe we can discuss this later. I write 2 columns every week, and I come out on 3 radio programs and news program, and we never talk about security. We talk about X number of things, and we talk about other kinds of issues, and we promote access to information and accountability from a different perspective. So we don't have to get into this. And with regard to journalists, we do tell them how to use the law and access to information so that they can try to do investigative journalism for a purpose. In other words, worthwhile journalism. So I'll stop there. Thank you. Y la última palabra para Miguel. It seems to me that part of Marcos's question includes a set of answers. If people aren't exercising, or rather we're wondering whether people are mixing up RTI with other issues in other countries, and say that people in the business sector are the ones who request the most information, I think that's a very powerful mixture. For the following reason. In Mexico, we have around, and it depends on the historic source that you use, but about 80 or 90 years of electoral tradition with respect for vote, and since 1950, women have had the right to vote. The right to information has only existed for 8 years under legislation, and the first case that went to the Supreme Court went in 1985, and it lost, and then the first case that one in court before the constitutional establishment of the right to information came out in 1996. So I just wanted to say this because it's important to take a historic perspective and to understand the political community. Otherwise, we get very frustrated when we try to measure Mexico of today and compare it with countries that not only have a longer political or cultural tradition in this, as Memo was describing, but also a tradition of practicing this. Bureaucracy gets professionalized over time, for better or for worse. But I do think that that's the first thing to be borne in mind. And I say that this is powerful because this has to do with who puts too much faith in RTI and in other things. And I believe that what we've learned over the last 6 years with Fundar, for example, we shared with what Gabriela said, we were mistaken. We thought that we could train everybody so that everybody could be requesters of information. That was a mistaken approach. And this only happens when you have an RTI system. We in the civil society organizations often make mistakes. The problem is to learn from that over time. So I think that today we have some organizations that are much more solvent, and I'm going to try to respond to what Leonel said with this cross-referencing of ideas. We have to look at what Guillermo does in the program. What is the problem that we're trying to address? Based on that problem, we try to see how powerful RTI is in solving that problem. However, our organizations also have to document our case regarding RTI, and also we have to have a possibility for political to be political actors. It's a complex scenario, and RTI is. If you think it's going to resolve everything, then that is not helpful. We put together for a special exercise, and here I'm trying to answer your question. We've talked about the possibility for information to be systematically treated. That's information that's already in government offices, and we try to make it useful for citizens. Over 18 months, we made requests for access to information regarding the subsidy roles progress done with the Environmental Working Group and UC Santa Cruz. I just wanted to bring up this exercise because I think that involves two very concrete things. First, Fundar understood what his contribution could be as a requester, and then by creating an electronic platform, by learning from those who already knew, and that platform must be more than 2.8 billion consultations. It's an access platform. So it means that there are people, requesters from the outside, who, in Kate's terms, are not exactly seeing their right to information getting answered by the state, but they are doing it through Fundar. Why do I mention this? This is relevant to us because we made it apparent that the reason that governments are not transparent or do not process the information at the service of the citizens is not because of a lack of resources, but rather lack of political will. Fundar's budget is infinitely smaller than the media or communications budget of the Secretary of Agriculture. I'm not talking about the whole Ministry of Agriculture's budget, just the public communication section. So it's an abysmal difference. However, the communications unit of the Ministry of Agriculture never tried to make this information public. Now, while I understand very well that there is a cultural problem and that there may be historic ramifications, and if this were my responsibility, if I were a dictator and I thought that this would be, if it were my responsibility and I had a magic wand to resolve all of these problems of RTI, that was the question, if I were the government and had a lot of money. Well, I was trained as an attorney, but I think regardless of the cultural problems of not enough requests and people are not accustomed to demanding information, as Guillermo said, it seems to me that when the legal system is designed to hide rather than to operate, when there are just a few people trying to overcome that culture of not having accountability and not demanding information, then you come up against a wall. And there's never going to be a cultural transformation if whoever works on this hits up against the wall. The first obstacle is the flaws in the design of the law. So that's the first problem. Then there's a problem of political will, which is what I try to explain with the area of subsidies for farm workers. And I want to correct a mistake I made in my initial presentation. I was trying to talk about paradoxes, and I said dilemmas. What we have in Mexico are paradoxes that then lead to dilemmas. And now, just like with the ranchero songs, I'm going to try to finish with this. But what we have here, we have signed multiple international treaties on human rights. However, judges consider this to be foreign law. That has been explicitly said by justices in the court. What I'm trying to say is that we have structural problems as a country, but then any right to vote, to citizens' participation, to information, to health, all of these are receptive to these structures. So when I look at the structural problems that we're facing, we have to see which of these would be receptive to RTI. To me, the major problem that my country is experiencing has to do with the fact that legislative reform is just a ruling by populism. The political policy legislates a lot of very advanced, progressive things, but it's to cover the fact that they're not
we're
really
going to have
progressive.
to close, actually. Wanda will come up and close this session. Let me make two announcements before she thanks our panelists. And I want to personally thank you, but I'll let her do the formal thanking for a great discussion. Two announcements. One, when you leave, if you have translation equipment, please leave them outside. They will collect them at the door. And secondly, for those who want to continue this discussion, it occurred to me I should have mentioned Jacqueline Pichard, who's the president of the Federal Institute for Access to Information, will actually be here on November 15th. She's not coming to talk about this issue, believe it or not. She's coming to talk about a book that we've co-edited on Mexican politics. But you may ask her about this issue. I mean, I think she will be more than ready to talk about many of these things, and particularly some of the new responsibilities that the EFI has and the lack of budget and other issues. So on November 15th, keep that on your calendar. Next week, October 22nd, we're also launching a major report on security that Eric Olson has coordinated. So.
Thank you, Andrew. And I wanted to thank all of our speakers from the three organizations from Mexico that have worked over these years closely with the Open Society Foundations, and thank our two commentators, Kate and Daniel. And I know Daniel has to go really fast because he is supposed to be teaching a class right now. And I want to invite all of you to join us outside for a lunch and further discussion. So thank you.
Thank you. Right across the way here.
Un placer, ¿eh? Dan. Muchas gracias.
Verte, mano.
Sí, sí. Lo que ocupes.
¿Por cuánto tiempo están aquí ustedes?
Yo me regreso mañana.